So good evening and good morning, everybody, depending on where you are in the world right now. Welcome to our Table Talk episode 7. This is the Indian Animal Studies Collective. We are a collective, a group of scholars who try to come together with others in the field and try to investigate if there is such a thing as an Indian animal and an Indian animal studies. And in the quest for these answers, we invite prominent scholars from this field and try to engage with them to find these answers that we are seeking together in the collective. Today, our guest is Anand Taneja from Vanderbilt University. Anand is assistant professor at the University of Vanderbilt for religious studies and anthropology. And we will be talking to him today about two of his articles. The first one is called Saintly Animals, and the second one, which he has very generously made available to us as a preprint, is Sharing a Room with Sparrows. So welcome, Anand, and we shall start right away with questions, comments, ideas, thoughts that any of us have. All of you that are here, please feel free to pipe in with your questions, your thoughts, your comments. Just raise your hands or unmute yourself and start speaking. Or if you're more comfortable typing your question into the chat, we can do it that way too. So, Anand, reading your two articles, it was fascinating to see how you present the place of animals in Islam as seen in lived practices of veneration in North India on the one hand, in your first text, and in the writings of an intellectual or leading scholar like Maulana Azad on the other hand. And at the same time, you draw attention to how there is a vast space in between where animals have been largely disappeared. For example, in the lived experiences in a city like Delhi and other parts of North India. Coming to the first text that we've taken from you, Saintly Animals, you mentioned that your interest in jinn veneration led the Imam from Darul Uloom Deoband to mention the vulture story as a parallel which he saw as a deviance and superstition of popular belief related to Muslim saints. I find this very interesting because somehow it seems to me that your interest in one more than human or other than human entity made him mention another one. So although he wanted to emphasize the rationality of Islam and the focus on human beings, he ended up serving as a source that made you aware of another non-anthropocentric way of going about your research. Did you too find this ironical?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I don't think it's ironic. I mean, in some sense, of course, it is obviously ironic, right? That he was trying to prove the point to me that this belongs to the category of superstition, right? So both jinns and vultures, but it also points us to, how the field of religion itself is choosing to redefine itself, right? So if we look at Deoband as a reformist movement, which starts in the late 19th century, the burden on them, right, after 1857 is to reform Islam, right? That we are to make it more compatible with modern rationality, which is being imposed by the British. And one aspect of that rationality is to very clearly demarcate the zones between what is human and what is not human, right? Now, this is not the case with pre-modern Islam or many other religious traditions, certainly not with Hinduism, for example. And this kind of zone of the interaction between the human and the non-human in pre-modern Muslim societies is a very productive one. So one of the books I often teach is The Animal in Ottoman Egypt, which is not about the supernatural at all, right? Which is not about shrines or graves, but it is about the very productive place that dogs and cattle played in Ottoman society, right? So, and they were venerated, not venerated, but they were taken care of, right? So we have an image of dogs as being something that are considered unclean animals in Islam, right? But if you look at 17th century Cairo, dogs are actually being taken care of because they play a very productive role in, in keeping, in basically garbage disposal for the city. So you could be punished for hurting a dog, right? And they were there was water set out for them, food set out for them. So there is a kind of investment in dogs as productive members of this more than human social order. And I think this more than human social order is something that was actually quite prominent, right? With resonances of which show up in the veneration of jinn at Firozshah Kotla again, right? Because the jinn shapeshift into animals, and in the stories I encountered about animal shrines in the UP countryside when I was kind of searching for the vulture shrine, right? So I heard all these stories of horses, Ghode ka mazar, Ghode Shah ka mazar, Bille Shah ka mazar, which I mentioned. So there is an older world of both sacrality and just sociality, which is larger than human, which is now, with modern anxieties about religion, is pushed into the domain of superstition. But I think recovering which actually makes huge sense for us when we are trying to think of, ecological thought in the contemporary. So
it's also really interesting for me. I was born and lived the first 18 years of my life in Lucknow. There are parts of my childhood that I don't remember so clearly anymore. It's been a long time. But reading your article, especially saying the animals, reminded me, I mean, it's almost Proustian somehow. I read this and I remembered these little instances from my childhood of people mentioning similar things, things which I didn't see with my own eyes. It wasn't there in a city like Lucknow. But these were practices that existed in the countryside in particular. And so let's say that my classmates in school who happen to be Muslims would not be likely to mention Bille Shah or Ghode Shah or something of the sort as a part of their practice of Islam. But someone who came to work at our place would sometimes tell us, oh, I have to go to my village because there is this mela and there is so and so ka mazar, and it was often an animal, And these are things which I had forgotten in all of these years. It just had not registered. I was a child in those days, and I think this big distinction between human and animal was not prominent in my child's head at that moment. But now when I read your text, I remember that this was really there, prominently there, but also, not as something that was condoned by the orthodoxy. So you weren't likely to come across it in a city like Lucknow, but elsewhere. Coming to the long-standing trope in Islamic countries, which you mentioned, of the misrecognition of an animal grave for the grave of a human saint, the tenor of these stories is always humorous, such as in Sheikh Kesudaraz's anecdote. And humor, of course, has an element of sympathy, an element of acceptance of something, of practice, of something given. How do you explain this roundabout or sort of backdoor way of including animal saints?
Thank you for that question. I don't know if it's that backdoor, right? If you look at the story that Sheikh Kesudaraz tells, for example, the way he tells the story, there were 5 of them and the 6th was a dog, or there were 7 of them. That is totally echoing Surah Al-Kahf of the Quran, right? Which is the surah that it's very canonical in the sense that this is the chapter of the cave, which is supposed to be recited every Friday, for example, right? And in that, there is a story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. 7 sleepers of Ephesus in the Christian tradition were young men who go and hide away because they're being persecuted. And in the Quran, and not in the Christian story, they are accompanied by a dog, and the dog kind of is their protector and their guardian. So in the very phrasing of the story, he is invoking the Surat Al-Kahf in the telling of the story, right? In the account Kesudaraz gives. I kind of put that in a footnote, but now that I think about it, it's not backdoor at all. It is like, this is as canonical as the story gets. That being said, And we know of stories of, there's a story I tell in that article from Kichaucha Sharif, right, where there's a cat who's buried next to the saint because the cat saves the lives of people because it, sacrifices itself for the sake of, making sure that people don't get poisoned, right, because the snake has fallen into the food. All of these stories, being buried next to a saint, telling a story that directly invokes a surah from the Quran. I mean, there is humor, right? But I don't think it's backdoor at all. I think what it's implying is that there was a recognition that animals could be saintly in the sense of being moral exemplars for humans, which wasn't marginal or backdoor at all, right? But which has become that because of the anxieties, which are not just in Islam, but in all religious traditions, of making religion rational, right? Which means the exclusion of the non-human.
Yeah, you mentioned the example also of how Hanuman, for example, is now he's represented as image, as more than ape-like.
Yeah. No, that's Philip Lutgendorf's work from from not that long ago, where he talks about how the image of Hanuman himself goes from being much more, animalistic, monkey-like, to becoming much more, human, with, just vestigial monkey characteristics. So.
Then on to my next question, what you had mentioned about Bille Shah, and how you traced the story of how Bille Shah was rendered invisible, so to speak, so that his narrative could be overwritten with that of Pir Mujahid Sahib, roughly 35 years ago. In Shaddan Mia's telling, Bille Shah is effectively de-sanctified by alleged association with everything that's bad and immoral, so by association with a prostitute, so to speak, who also happens to be a Shia. So there's a kind of an othering by association. I mean, Bille Shah is, of course, a cat to begin with, and then he's associated with a prostitute who happens to be a Shia. It seems to me, though, reading your text, that the legend of Bille Shah lives on, and the Mazar is still known as Bille Shah's Mazar. Am I right about that?
That area is still known in the maps as Mazar Billah.
Yeah, you mentioned right. So people have obviously not made this transition from Bille Shah to Pir Mujahid Sahib. Has this new narrative been accepted at all? What was your experience in the field?
I mean, I think it's contested, right? And I was looking at all of this in 2014, so 7 years ago, 8 years. Yes, I haven't been back. But I think, as with all things, these things take time, right? So the narrative survives simultaneously for a while, but and the memory is fragmented, right? So Shias will remember this differently, Sunnis will remember this differently, but at some point, one of these narratives is going to become more dominant, and the other is going to disappear, right? Like with all things, these things, you can have two radically different narratives, and one becomes more acceptable, right? Because one is more theologically and socially acceptable, and one is not. And eventually, one of them will probably replace the other. But I don't know. It depends on the forms of contestation that are going on in Mohan right now, and those I'm not familiar with, so I really can't say more about that.
And it's probably also not been long enough, because when you wrote your article, it had just been 35 years roughly, and I mean now it's been whatever. Another 5, and I guess it takes much longer for the overwriting to either take or to be rejected outright. I mean, we'll see, but it's an interesting question, definitely, to see what happens. The other thing that I wondered while reading your article was whether syncretic spaces or practices are more welcoming and accommodating of animals simply because they are syncretic, and open to influences.
So in my work, I generally tend to go away from the idea of syncretism because syncretism implies that there's a mixing and an unholy kind of mixture of things, as opposed to things being coherent within a particular religious tradition. So places where people of different religions come together are not necessarily syncretic, right? In my understanding, if we look at some place like Firozshah Kotla, the whole vocabulary, even though it is a place where you have Hindus and Muslims coming together, the whole vocabulary and the grammar of ritual and all of that is very, very Muslim. And I think what we are seeing, the ways in which, for example, animals are fed at that site or venerated, is very, very, again, we can see continuities there with pre-modern Muslim traditions and traditions that you see elsewhere, right? Like, for example, throwing meat to the kites. For example, the idea that these animals actually could potentially be saintly because jinns are shapeshifters, right? So in one sense, a place like Firozshah Kotla is completely coherent within the Islamic tradition. Likewise, the samadhi of the Gid, which is not a mazar of Gid Shah, but a samadhi, right? And I think it's interesting that my friend the Imam kind of made the switch between and thought of it as a mazar. It's not. It's always been a Hindu space and with a very Hindu grammar. And there, the idea of the Gids are venerated again because they're figures of moral aspiration. Giddin Satte no way, right? Like the female Gid is a sati who essentially dies mourning for her husband. So dies like the best death that a woman can die in, or like a female can die in the Hindu tradition, right? And the time when the site is venerated is the period of Shraddh. So again, it's totally tied up with Hindu practices of ancestor worship. So neither of these places, even if they have a variety of religious people of different religious identities coming together, are syncretic. What they are is not constrained by anxieties of purification, which are a part of modern religious life, which I think is a different matter from syncretism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that now. Because you just mentioned the practice of flinging meat for the kites at Firozshah Kotla. I also remembered that I found that really interesting because it's also rather different. I mean, this concept of the Jaan ka Sappa, the normal, like the usual practice is that one touches a buffalo or a goat or a lamb or something, and then gives it away for slaughter so that the meat is distributed to the destitute and the poor. And by that, one, what they call balatali sort of a thing. So, you divest, you save yourself from whatever it was that was bothering you. And here it's interesting because the Jaan ka Sapka is given not to human poor or destitutes, but to these animals, to the kites, the meat flung up in the air for them to sort of catch. And that, I don't know if it happens elsewhere. I think Firozshah Kotla, I read about it in your article, and then I found a video of this also, of course, on YouTube. And then I think that there is a similar practice somewhere in Lahore, but I don't know. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think I might mention again, buried in the footnotes, but yeah, David Pinot writes about the same thing in Lahore. So yeah, this happens in Lahore too, and this also happens in places in Old Delhi, and then that kind of transfers into Firozshah Kotla quite recently. It wasn't happening when I started my fieldwork, but it's very much an established practice now. So
yeah, and how do you explain at all this sort of sharp difference, contradiction, contrast between this increasing absence of animals from public spaces in, let's say, Old Delhi, as well as probably other urban centers in North India, where they are, as you say in your article, also reduced to bare life, and their continued and persistent presence as saints in popular practice, for example, at Firozshah Kotla. How do these two extremes coexist in one and the same city?
That's a really good question. I think what I see at Firozshah Kotla is a form of persistence, right? That you're holding on to older ways of being in the world and interacting with the world. Um, and that is a space that which people have returned to again and again in the face of destruction, right? So Firozshah Kotla um, first becomes prominent as a sacred site in Delhi in the 1970s, 1977, right? In the months after the emergency ends, which is very destructive for the life world of old Delhi. In the larger project, I talk about it as a space of memory, right? That it is a space that allows you to reclaim older connections to the sacrality of the city, which, for example, the post-colonial, post-partition state has tried to erase. And I think it's similar with the ways in which people there interact with animals and with other non-humans, right? With the figures of jinn, that you are really trying to. This is a space of memory in the face of destruction, where you are trying to reclaim and kind of reinvigorate practices that are practices and forms of knowing and being in the world and connecting to the world that are being lost everywhere else, right? Um, so it exists precisely in resistance. I mean, resistance is a is not the best word because it implies that there's something that people are necessarily very consciously aware of. But at some level of thought, I think religious thought opens up certain kinds of possibilities um, of pushing against destruction, right? The overwhelming forces of destruction, right? The religion allows you to allow the possibility of different life worlds, so and to reclaim them, right? Precisely at the moment where they're being lost everywhere else.
Yeah. And the other thing that struck me was the fact that, I mean, this idea that animals have rights, the right to life, the right not to be killed, and legal protection from hunting, trapping, enslaving, and maltreatment by humans, as you show in the story of Shah Waliullah killing a snake. Um, uh, and Ifan al-Safa's The Case of the Animals versus Man seems extremely progressive to me, and it's striking also because in popular imagination one does not think of Islam as a religion that is intimately connected to animals. That, of course, I mean, it's the way uh, the modern sort of practice of the religion has developed, but also in the way that the popular image of Islam and of Muslims has been created. But that said, even apart from that, it seems like a really progressive idea because I'm trying to think. I mean, being respectful towards animals is not just a moral imperative here. There's like legal protection for them. You know? Is there anything comparable in narratives from other religious or cultural contexts that you can think of or that you're aware of?
I mean, the prohibition on the taking of animal life is so well developed in India, right, among other places. So, I mean, what's happening with that, of course, right now is problematic in itself. Um, but no, I mean, I'm not aware of these things because I don't study them, right? So this is, you're asking me, aapne out of syllabus question push liya, like literally. But yeah, what I mean, the point you raised is right. Is if we speak just about Islamic traditions, there are actually very well developed traditions of respect for animals, which we don't think of because the image of Islam as being, I mean, especially related to slaughter is one of actually of indifference and cruelty towards animal life, right? But even if we think of the act of slaughter as it is originally imagined, right, the act of zibah is meant to be a kind of sanctified act, right, where you are being very grateful to the animal for sacrificing itself for you, rather than it being a kind of indiscriminate slaughter and meat eating, right? So, I mean, from what I know, the Prophet only used to eat meat, on Eid or like twice a year at most, right? Because it was, they lived pretty simple lives, and without mass refrigeration technologies, no one's really eating meat unless kill it that day.
Yeah.
And that was like, meat was always considered, wasn't, yeah, meat was not definitional of Islam as it has become in all these complicated, messy ways of diet and identity politics that are now the case. So
no, I meant also in connection with other religions, for example, not just with other traditions within Islam.
I mean, if we think of Christianity, right, the whole Franciscan relation to animals, for example, is yeah. And of course, Buddhism has all kinds of prohibitions on the treatment of animals and other kinds. But yeah, beyond that, I'm not really familiar. But I think if we look at native traditions in the Americas, even though there's no prohibition as such on the consumption of meat, the ways in which animals are thought of and treated and dealt with is a very is a very productive field that I don't know enough about. So
I think Susan has a question.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying in relation to the other essay about living with sparrows.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that perhaps in some pre-modern times, things were less anthropocentric because there was a stronger sense of kinship and what you call like a proper relationship to other forms of life.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, I noticed that you reject categories such as religion, and now kinship is such a used word to capture any kinds of intimate relationships with animals. And could you talk more about what this kinship really means?
So when I mean, there's a big move in anthropology, as you point out, of moving away from kinship as being biological, right, or as being merely biological. That it is that it actually implies a whole variety of intimacies, right, and of finding kin, of kin, as in also finding similarities between you and another. And in that sense, if we look at Maulana Azad's writings from prison, the ways in which, in the essays I look at, the ways in which he writes about his relationship with birds is really about finding them to be akin to him, right? So I'm thinking of the letter he writes where he's talking about, when the prisoners at Ahmednagar Fort build a garden, and then the garden has bulbuls coming to it. And he is imaginatively talking about how, right, every afternoon when he gets up from his nap and sits down to write, that's the precise moment where the bulbuls start singing, as if the bulbuls are recognizing their kinship with him, right? Here is someone who's going to sit down and open the wounds of his heart and let the things pour forth. So this is the time we will sing. And in doing that, he is kind of creating that, finding himself akin to the birds. He's also drawing on a long tradition of Persian poetry, right, where he is, for example, drawing on someone like Hafiz, right, who's the master, who's the Persian poet, right, who's everyone is reads and knows and says, Murgan Baag Kafiya Sanjad Bazlago Ta Khaja Mehfurad Baghazal Hai Pahlavi, right? That there is when the birds of the garden sing and come up with witticisms, right? So there's, in the way that the birds sing is the inspiration for the master to start reciting ghazals in Persian. And that kind of inspirational relationship between birds inspiring humans to sing is very interesting, because again, like you see in Saintly Animals, in the article in Saintly Animals, I'm talking about how humans, how saints become saints are figures of moral exemplars for humans, and you have animals as saints. Here you have animals as figures of inspiration for humans, right? Which is usually thought to be, at least in Islamic cosmology, the angelic realm, right? That's where things are coming from. So again, you're tying up birds to a realm that is in some senses superior to humans, but akin, right? There is a relation of kinship there. Now, if we think of all of this as, if we use the word religious for any or all of this, it both, in some sense, it limits what's going on, right? Because is Hafiz only religious? I mean, like, people use the Diwan of Hafiz. It's the book next to the Quran, right? In Persian households. And for someone like Maulana Azad, who grew up with the kind of, as a Persian, in an elite Indian Muslim household where, Persian is essentially the second language of the religion. But we also miss the ways in which, when we talk about religion, we don't think about things like play. We don't think about, the kinds of ways in which Azad is thinking very, very freely. I mean, there's a reason he calls himself Azad, right? He is a free thinker by his own definition. And the ways in which he can bring together, Persian poetic tradition with his own experience in a jail cell, and, as Amir Mufti points out, making it a kind of allegory for how minorities and majorities should relate to each other. So, I think the reason that I don't use the term religion is that it just, it gums up the works, because we've inherited a very impoverished and somewhat draconian understanding of what religion is. Mm-hmm. And so if we use the term, we are just losing a lot of the plenitude of what's going on. Which is not to say that someone like Azad might not have recognized what he was doing as religious. It's just that if we use that term analytically, we risk losing more than we gain in terms of understanding.
I just had a follow-up question. It's so interesting, because when people talk about non-anthropocentric approaches, there's a lot of emphasis on decentering the human, or making the human itself, making the human out to be constituted by the human and the non-human. But in the letters and even in the first essay, the idea of kinship seems to rely on some kind of sociality.
Yeah.
Which is some kind of conference with animals more than human creatures, but at the same time, it does not really remove or destroy the concept of the human itself. And the human seems, but at the same time, there is no sense of pride or anthropocentrism, or the hubris that we associate with anthropocentrism in that kind of association. Why do you think that happens? Is it because of the poetic tradition, or is it, I don't know, it sounds naive to call it just a sense of humility from the part of the speaker, which would mean that it's something that only some people possess. Only some thinkers would have this idea of sociality or kinship with other animals. But I feel like what you're suggesting is that it's also a difference of the historical era.
Yeah, I think to connect, thank you for that question. I think to connect it with the earlier article and what Anu was saying. I mean, Azad is the inheritor of this kind of very high literate Islamic tradition, which includes things like the case of the animals versus man before the king of the jinn, which includes the poetry of Hafiz, which includes this kind of larger ethos where the human is, of course, the human is, in the Quran, Ashraful Makhluqat, the best of creation. But that doesn't mean that humans are, at least in the pre-modern Islamic tradition, that doesn't mean that humans are the only figures, only moral persons in the world, right? You actually share a planet with and if you look at the Quran itself, right, you have the dog in the Surah Al-Kahf, but you also have in the Surah Nahl, you have the bee who is a recipient of revelation, right? You have essentially all aspects of creation except for the humans being faithful to God, right, and humans being forgetful. So there is a long tradition that he's coming from where sociality, right, the sociality and morality are not just human domains, right, that where it extends far beyond the human. And so because of this, I think when he is in confinement in Ahmednagar jail, because this is already a worldview that he carries with him, it is kind of easy for him to embody that. And I think what your question's making me think about, the larger of Gubare Khatir, right, which is him writing letters intimately from jail to his friend. And it is really interesting how few human interactions there are in those letters, right? He talks about Jawaharlal Nehru snoring in the cell next to him, but he's not talking about conversations he's having with Nehru. And Nehru and Azad were actually good friends. So, but when he's talking about the things that and that might be because he knew, maybe because he knew his letters would be read by censors, or maybe whatever. Like he knew, so he didn't want to do sensitive information reveal. But I also think it is like here is someone who is actually reveling in the fact of his sociality with non-humans, right? And partly that I think is his character. He was, but I think it is also coming from the tradition that he was an inheritor of, right? Like very consciously and carried with him. So which allowed him to kind of then make that kind of get into that sociality, which was more than human.
But just thinking about what you were saying about syncretism earlier as well, it's a bit. Is this sociality a kind of how is this sociality different from what we may call today? Now there is so much talk about multiplicity, multi-species, and so on, but it also sounds like this sociality is not just a mere multiplicity or a mere plurality. Because you said that earlier, you said that the syncretism, you don't think that it is syncretism because syncretism would mean just an intermixing of everything, whereas everything seems to exist separately. And even in the sociality, there is certainly a distinct sense of what is human and what is non-human.
Yeah.
And they are certainly different realms, though there is a social meeting of the 2 points. And just in connection to that, what sociality means, if it is a multiplicity or something else, it'd be interesting to know what you mean. But also, I was thinking about in the letters, when there's the garden as a distinct separate space, and the ethics associated with it.
Yes.
And there is also the jail, which is also literally a distinct separate space.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about it in connection with the sociality. And is it possible that what makes such thinking happen is that man is in a distinct separate space where he can imagine then what other connections he has to other living beings and so on. Because even if we think about great poetry about animals, these poets set themselves aside as people, set themselves aside from the world. So it seems like there is a distinct separation also happening. I'd be curious to know if we can push this conceptually.
We could, but I was going to say, I mean, when you think of if you mention the poetry, um, in the Urdu, in the Persian and Urdu poetic traditions, there's such a long tradition of poets speaking in the interior voices of birds. I mean, that's a stylistic thing they do, right? So Ghalib says, I quote this in the कफस में मुझसे रुदादे चमन कहते न डर हमदम गिरी है जिस पे कल बिजली वो मेरा आशियां क्यों हो, right? So it's the voice of a bird who's captured in a cage and is talking to his fellow bird in the cage and saying, why are you afraid of telling me the story of the garden? I mean, but the one of which lightning fell, why would it be my nest? So this idea that, you know, at a moment of crisis, right, it is, there's this profound empathy with, and however stylized it might be, with the figure of birds. And that is something that human poets feel very comfortable kind of inhabiting and speaking from that position, I think is very interesting. And I think, again, stylistically speaking, the garden, right, becomes the space of multi-species encounter, right, in Urdu poetry. Now, this might be happening partly because gardens were species of cultivated species of multi-species, cultivated spaces of multi-species encounter. All of which is to say that, in a sense, of course, the Islamic tradition, right, does exalt the human, does give the human a special position. However, it is not an exclusive position, right? It is not that humans are the only possessors of speech, of morality, of ethical action. And hence, you have an encounter, when you're encountering an animal, it is not just an encounter with, you know, man versus wild, it is an encounter with another moral being, right? And that doesn't mean that that encounter may not include violence of many sorts. I think it is interesting for me to kind of explore this, because when we talk of multi-species encounter, the vocabulary we have is of, you know, is very recent. If we look at the way in which Western theory is talking about multi-species encounter, Donna Haraway onwards, it's like, oh wow, we discovered this shit. We didn't, right? We had to rediscover it because, in a sense, we are inheritors of a tradition in which the domain between human and animal has been cleaved. Other people in other traditions haven't lived like that or haven't thought like that, and they may have differing you know, commitments from us, right? So for an Islamic tradition, you can't get away from the you know, the human being the central thing, right? Because that's the story, that we are the best of creation. But it doesn't preclude, right, all of these other kinds of encounters and intimacies. In other religious traditions, things might be way more egalitarian, right? But I think, right, in this tradition, I don't think you necessarily need, I think, right, a formal ontological egalitarianism for the kinds of encounters and possibilities that Azad has, right? Which is not to say that other things might not be possible.
Does anybody else have a question now, or shall I go ahead to something that I had in mind? Anand, you referred to Amir Mufti's reading of Maulana Azad's account as allegorical, and you say, and I completely agree, that if one were to only do that, then it would silence and marginalize the real birds, which would be really a travesty and a shame. But still, this sort of allegory is really interesting and unusual, because on the one hand, I find usually when animals are used as symbols of minorities or the marginalized, the narrative is usually one of oppression. You know,
Yeah.
It's grim, it's somber, it's a narrative of suffering, so to speak. here it is humorous, and the birds are constantly thwarting Maulana Azad's efforts to evict them.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
funny, and one roots for the birds, one roots for the
Yeah.
sparrows, so that they succeed and he doesn't.
Mm.
They get the better of him again and again until he comes to an acceptance of Sulai Kul, basically. Um, so there's no like anger in the text, there's no hatred, there's no negative, so to speak, emotion. Even when he pretends to be mad at them, he's pretending. It's like a mock heroic battle that he wages. There's empathy, there's gentleness and caring. And I find that a really beautiful way of having an allegorical reading. You know. Instead of normal allegorical readings are like unjust, and I'm quite against them. But this one, yeah, if there had to be one, and if this had to be the story of the majority Hindu population and the minority Muslim population in India, and how the majority population should behave so that things can work out, then yeah, I think this is a really beautiful way of doing it. So,
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I think my Mufti characterizes this as how this is an allegory for how majorities should deal with minorities, right? But as you point out, part of the reason that Azad is compelled to act the ways in which he does is because the minorities, in this case the birds, if we run with the allegory, are very agentive, right? And he is right, and they refuse to be chased out from the dwelling they share together, and essentially they refuse to be afraid, and so he has to adjust his behavior accordingly. I think what is interesting is now if we were to take Mufti seriously as I do and say, well, he's being allegorical, well, Azad often talks of himself as the human figure, as the majority figure, as he talks about himself literally as a murti, right? So, whereas all the birds are Muslims, one is a kalandar, one is a Sufi, one is a Buttannaz, right, an idol mocker. So there is definitely, the birds are Muslim. He may or may not be, at least in this account, a Hindu. But that being the case, I think it's not just an allegory for how majorities should behave with minorities, because in saying that, Mufti, who's not an animal studies person, right, is ignoring the ways in which the minorities in this case are extraordinarily agentive, which is what forces the majority to come to a rethinking of how I am to behave in this manner. And I think it was just, I think it is really I really like the move Mufti makes to, okay, this is an allegory and we should think about it. But I think his reading of the allegory is incomplete, right? Because it only becomes about how the majority should behave. Actually, it's very much about how the behavior of minorities actually creates the condition for the majority to be the gentle, accepting majority that he's talking about. Now, this also ties up, I think, much better with Azad's overall political thought, in which minorities are always agentive. They're not at the mercy of the majoritarian state, or they're not recipients of secular chivalry, if I could use Mukul Keswan's language. Minorities have a special position. They're not just minorities, minorities have a position of moral leadership, right, which allows society to actually function pluralistically. And yeah, minorities have no reason to be afraid. That was his position, right, pre-partition and post-partition. And I think, yeah, if we tie this up, read this allegory with his larger thought about minorities, then that actually opens up the question. And of course, now, once we get animals into the conversation, then it becomes an even more kind of productive set of things. But even if we just think of it in terms of human politics, for Azad, minorities are actually far more agentive than majorities in the creation of pluralism, right, or functioning pluralism. So, yeah.
And yeah, it's you're right. It's really fertile. One can read this, of course, and one should read this, of course, from an animal studies sort of perspective. Also, well, then to see uh, this idea of transformation of the self. So the Sulai Kul
Yeah.
basically is not just forging peace with the other, learning to tolerate, learning to coexist. It's changing oneself radically so that
Yeah.
those differences don't seem to matter so much anymore. And you're right, because the text, the writings of Maulana Azad coming from the lockdown he underwent in
Yeah.
the Ahmedabad fort, and the experiences that we've had globally in recent times of being also locked up and sort of rediscovering animals, as it were, animals that one had gotten used to largely overlooking, though some of them were there. Um,
Yeah.
I think similar processes have, to some extent, taken place around the world in people's lives, in sort of learning to look at the other, the animal other again, and in sort of learning not only to tolerate the animal other, because I think that's as far as one had come pre-lockdown, but in this sort of enforced isolation to, radically rethink what it means to be a human with an animal, and what sort of a degree of self-transformation one is capable of. So it's a really beautiful takeaway from the text, I felt. Also lovely the way Maulana Azad becomes kind of intimate with the sparrows, from a point of time where he wanted them to go away and he was trying to chase them away with his umbrella in the beginning, to accepting their presence, protecting his space, his territory, so there wouldn't be droppings from the nests and stuff, and then actually encouraging them to come closer and closer to him, feeding them to the point where he starts feeding them out of his own palm, and deciding that this is way better than putting the food for them in the cigarette holder, the tin box or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
And as you point out in the text, the transformation that this brings about in him, this man of high status being ready to sweep his cell on his own while no one was watching, um, who was willing to turn into stone for a while so that the birds would approach him, who was willing to let them peck the grains out of his hand, although there was always the risk that maybe one of the little bird beaks would hurt him. It is this process of transforming the self to accept the other. And it's a kind of, I mean, in particular, in the way he describes Moti, I find also something very reminiscent of ghazals, this thing of the beloved almost. There is such an intimate tone to it, Sure, it's a sparrow and he calls her Moti, but in the way she's described, it's really like a ghazal about the beloved somehow.
Yeah, with all the Nas.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The vocabulary is really redolent with all these imagery from ghazals. The other thing that struck me reading this text was you pointed out how gardens and birds figure very often in well, in Persian poetry, but also in ghazals in Urdu, which one has heard or read growing up in North India, of course. And it just struck me that very often the bird is presented. I mean, when there is like this voice of the bird appropriated by the poet to speak, um, there is also the qafas mentioned, and I wondered
Yeah.
if why. Allegorically, one can think of it as the spirit trapped or the separation and all of that. But very, very often, the bird and the qafas, the cage, occur together.
Yeah. Well, because very, very often you had caged birds, right, as part of human social life, right? You still see that everywhere. But and so you have this kind of um, so people both empathize with the condition of the bird as being trapped, and yet are completely complicit in trapping the birds and having them as part of their, part of the architecture of their lives, right? Like to have, and you see this. I mean, it's. Um, So you have birds in cages as part of people's homes and shops also. while at the same time you have this understanding that the caging and the trapping is a particularly traumatic experience, right? Which is why the kafas and the interior voice of birds is always said at the moment of right. It's always a moment of trauma or crisis that is being um, reflected by that. So yeah, so people have complicated relations to
Yeah. So the bird in the garden, and then the
Yeah.
bird in the cage. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have, I think, Krishnan Uni wants to say something. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Professor Anand, for that very interesting lecture. I wanted to ask you for the clarification on the point that you had raised earlier about religion, and I wanted to like ask for this. I mean, I wanted to set it in the context of certain dilemmas that we face, that we encounter in animal rights circles. So, for example, when you are like when we are speaking about creating a world that is more just for animals, like politically scripting the blueprint for a world that will be more just to animals, and then when we look towards religion or towards tradition for ways to do that, and we, for example, when we look at Hinduism,
Yeah.
we see that the considering animals as sacred or worshipping certain animals, because Hinduism always worships only certain animals and not other animals. So it is, quote unquote, speciesist in that sense, so which immediately becomes a problem. But even otherwise, for example, considering even the cow as sacred, it becomes a precondition for objectifying them and enslaving them. For
Yeah.
example, in Hyderabad, there is the ISKCON temple, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, and they have a purely white desi cow, which is tied up inside the temple premises all the time. And people come and pet the cow, and they seek blessings, and they leave. And so evidently, it is seen that the cow is it's a very sacred animal, and the people are worshipping the cow. But at the same time, in that pretext, the cow is the material life of the cow is one of enslavement. Similarly, in the case of elephants in Kerala also, the elephant is considered at times sacred and at times a grand animal, an animal of majesty and grandeur. And this allows for, like it sets an imaginative groundwork for capturing the animals from the wild and parading them for temple festivals and all that. And it is very objectifying because they also have a Malayalam, the language has a separate vocabulary for speaking about elephants, and it is all couched in religiosity and all that. So when we are speaking in animal rights circles about this, it becomes very difficult to go back to religion and borrow lessons from religion, because even if I were to suppose borrow from a specific local tradition within the religion, uh, because it is a political framework, right? There will always be questions of what about the other animals, and what about the entire religion of Hinduism, uh, which is violent towards Dalits by its very framework and by its very scripture,
Yeah.
according to the Ambedkarite view. And then if you turn to the Enlightenment rationality side of things, then that immediately leads to the factory farming setup and the animal agricultural setup and the instrumentalizing animal setup. So there is this tension and confusion about where to go for lessons to build better worlds. So how do we really think about that? Is this a consequence of thinking about religion as a whole package, something that you cannot really borrow bits from, but it comes as an entire package? Is it a problem of thinking about it like that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I don't know if I can answer it adequately, but I will try to do something. I think that's what I was saying, right? That if we use the term religion, then we actually uh, we lose a lot more than we gain by using the term religion, right? Because of course it's tied up with all kinds of violence and identity formation now, which we can't get rid of. And someone like Azad, when he's reading Hafiz and quoting Hafiz and inheriting this tradition, is not, um, he's not quoting the Quran. So there is, he is not kind of tied. I think there's intellectual traditions that we inherit from the past are all tied up with. There was no differentiation between religion and intellectual life, right? Right. Science and religion were not separate as they have become now. But of course, now we live in a world where um, religion is reified and is a tool for violence. So I guess I'd say two things, right? One is that I think when we are going back into looking at pre-modern traditions, we should not think of religion as a heuristic through which we approach them, right? Uh, and the second is to, but we do, I think tradition is a better better lens. And the second, I think, is to think about, as you were asking a question, I was thinking about Radhika Govindrajan's work on animal intimacies, right? That which ties up with Azad in a certain way, that it is the ground of actual intimacy with the animal that becomes the ground for thinking and affective relationships, rather than this idea of the cow being sacred, right? The relationship with the cow you have and own and live with, and or the birds you live with, versus the idea of the sacred cow, which allows people to do immense amounts of violence on, for example, Dalit and Muslim bodies, is right. I think intimacy and intellectual inquiry into past traditions without being burdened by the label of religion is the way forward. But we live in a minefield where everything can blow up in your face as soon as like someone says religion in the picture. So I don't know. I don't really know. For me, why reading Azad was kind of so much fun is because he is not burdened by any of that, right? He's just, even when he's in jail cell, he's just like, this is the life of my mind. This is my tradition, and within that, I can kind of create this world, right? So, yeah. And so it also is kind of an artifact of pre-partition India, right? Where you could have that in a sense, even though it wasn't that communal violence was not in the picture, but the ways in which it becomes so much more a part of the subcontinent, the politics of the subcontinent after 1947 is not present, right, in that text. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Susan?
Yeah, I had a question. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, I know you cite Timothy Morton in the beginning, and you introduce the essays as kind of an intervention into thinking about ecological thought. And I think in the Saintly Animals essay, towards the end, you refer to what you beautifully call local weaves of kinship and moral inspiration.
Yeah.
And could you talk about the connection between the local and the ecological? And this is as a person who is in my work, talking to animal rights activists. Though your essays are situated kind of historically, are you suggesting that even when we talk to, modern Indians who are kind of living in a very liberal framework, who are engaging with animal rights and so on, do you think there is a local to be excavated there as well, local in the sense of tradition or previous histories?
Yes, right. Like, I mean, I did. I mean, these were traditions I found by talking to people, right? I mean, of course, the Maulana Azad essay, I'm reading a text, which, of course, is a text that's available, right? I bought it at a bookshop. I didn't have to go to the archives to read Maulana Azad. But at Firoz Shah Kotla, these are people who are around, right? These are all traditions that are or these are all people who are modern Indians, who are our contemporaries, who are creating these kind of human and more than human worlds together. So I think it's not even a question of excavation, it's a question of knowing the local, right? It's a local intimacy, right? Which is what tends to get lost within, among other things, nationalist discourse, or right. And I think again, tying back to that question of intimacy, right, which Govindarajan raises in her work, right? What if you have, what is the relationship that you have with the local and the particular, and what are the ways in which that can allow you to have different kinds of openings to thinking about the human and more than human world. I'm just thinking of, walking down the street in Delhi, again, close to Firozshah Kotla, but not there, where there was a long line of auto rickshaws parked because it was a CNG filling station. And as I was walking, a mongoose with her babies crossed the street there and went in, and there was a auto driver who was standing there in that line, and he was looking at them and I was looking at them, and we looked at each other, and he said, "Acha lagta hai inko dekh ke," right? Like, and that the guy was not an intellectual, right? He's just someone who is living his life and doing his work, and we happened to share a moment where something unusual happens in a highly concretized city. And what do you do with that moment except to say that there are, if we just create those solidarities. What he said was, it looks good to see them. Thank you for the question. And if we can just kind of, out of moments like this, if we actually can make those into weaves as opposed to just things that happen and pass away, we could actually create something, right? That has something more viable. So
I think that this is all we have time for tonight, unless there is somebody else with a question or a comment. Well then, thank you so much, Anand, for joining us this evening and for listening to us and answering us so patiently. It's been really fascinating discovering your work, and we look forward to more. So we're going to keep our eyes and ears open, but do please keep us updated as and when you come up with more in this direction. And
thank you very
everybody
much.
else.
My pleasure.
Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Our next table talk will be on the 1st of October, same time, 7:30 p.m. Indian time. And it is going to be with Julie Urbanic on 2 chapters from her book, The Place of Animals. Have a great evening and a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.